Chris, I was asking him, I was hearing feedback. He said, no, Ray, that's your breathing. We've got these fancy microphones here. We can't decide whether we're going to break out in song, which hopefully we won't for your sake, but we're going to try these to get started with. So you'll notice that the title of this meeting is the Alfalfa and Stored Forage Conference. Now, for 35 years, Gary had the annual Alfalfa Conference. When he retired, you know, us young whippersnappers decided we're going to just modify things a bit. The Alfalfa Conference is tremendously successful, but we're going to add a little bit to the name to come up with some options for different stored forages. Gary, you may wonder why we're back to all alfalfa talks today. It is the queen of the forage. It is important, and it also fits in with some research funding that Dr. Teutsch has been working on, and he put into a proposal that he had done to put on just a single session covering all aspects of alfalfa production. So we're really pleased to be offering that to you today. And as I mentioned, we'll be recording these presentations, so we really think this will be a useful thing going down the road for you to be able to look back at and others to be able to look at. So I'm going to start with, we've given the title, Fine-Tuning Alfalfa Varietal Selection for the Mid-South. A lot of what I'll mention will overlap with some of the specific talks that you hear as we move through the morning. This may be the first time many of you have seen the look of our new forage website or updated forage website. The content's very similar, but our goal is to make it much easier to get to. For example, so you just Google KY forages like we've always told you to do, and this is what's going to come up. If you go right here to this little button, it's going to give all aspects of alfalfa management. Chris, that's probably where you'll have the link for the YouTube for the recordings of this meeting. I'll be talking about variety trials, so an easy way to get to that. So we're hoping the website will be a little easier to navigate. Again, the content's the same, but we've tried to categorize it into something that's quite easy for people to get to. And so if you wanted to see more detail on the variety trials that I'll be talking about, then that's where you'd go. So out on our Kentucky Forage and Grassland Council booth, we've got the Alfalfa Report, 2017 report. These come out each year, not just for alfalfa, but orchard grass, fescue, the range of forages that we're testing, we come out with these individual reports. They would have all of the varieties that are currently in the ground, currently in test, with detailed information. I'll explain a little bit more as I move in. But often people come to me and say, is it really worth it to plant a new variety? You know, it seems to cost a bit more to plant a new variety. Is it really worth it? And I'm going to go back to something that Dr. Jimmy Henning did in a summary a few years ago. And he looked at 20 location years of Kentucky alfalfa yield data. And he found that the best 5 varieties, when he summarized all those 24 years, yielded almost a ton per acre higher than the checks. So we definitely feel like improved varieties are worth it, but hopefully I can educate you a bit on considerations in deciding what varieties to plant. So you can go to that individual 2017 report. I'm not going to try to explain a lot of detail on this particular figure here because the numbers are small, but for each of the figures or tables in that report, it's going to say something like dry matter yield and stand persistence sown March 31st, 2015, and we have the data through 2017. So we not only have the yield data, the tons per acre, on the far right-hand column, we've got the total for those 3 years, but we've got things like the fall dormancy. I'll explain more in a minute. We've got things like percent stand over the years. You'll see that old variety of buffalo alfalfa is 81% stand even just after 2.5 years. So a reason to go with improved varieties is to get that stand persistence, to get that improved yield. Now we've also got at the end of that 2017 report a summary report. And this is the summary report for where we've tested Roundup Ready alfalfa yields. And so we've got all the Roundup Ready alfalfa varieties that we've had in our test over the last number of years. and we've summarized it. And let me go to the next slide to explain how better to interpret the summary report. So you're looking not at yields, not at tons per acre, you're looking at percentages. And I've moved here a close-up of the far right-hand side of that table that I showed you before. And you'll notice that we've got the mean from the trials that all the trials that we've planted over the last number of years. And what you're trying to find is you're trying to find a variety that is close to 100, which 100% would be average. It's close to 100 or better. So you're looking at varieties that are 100 or better, and then you know that they performed average or above average. The reason we put together these summary reports is because for you to find out how a particular variety has done over a number of years, you would have to go to the website and you'd have to pull up the reports from 2012 and 13 up to 17 and match those up, and that can get a bit confusing. So this is a way to kind of give a quick check. What are varieties that have done average to above average over time? These numbers would be based on yield, and I'll give you a lot of other considerations to think about when you're looking into what variety to choose. One other thing to notice is in parentheses, we've got the number of tests that that particular variety has been in. So one that's just been in 2 tests, you've got a number there, 101%, but the more tests it's been in, the more confidence you have that it's going to do well at different locations over different number of years. Now you've got in the back of your proceedings a copy of this publication. This is something that comes out each year in the Hay and Forage Grower magazine. And so it's got, you can go to alfalfa.org to download it, or you can actually purchase glossy copies. Some of you with seed companies may want to have copies of this available. But it gives ratings for all the varieties that are currently on the market in the U.S. And so it gives things, so I'm going to go in now into some of the more detailed considerations to think about and what variety to plant and kind of explain what those mean. So one thing that's on this report, and also we have it on our charts and our variety information, is dormancy, fall dormancy. Ranges from 1 and 2 fall dormancy, which is very dormant, up to 10 and 11. And the long and short of this is how much growth that alfalfa has in the fall of the year. So if you live in Alaska, or you've got a cousin in Alaska and he's asking what variety to plant, you want to tell him to plant something that's not going to grow much in the late summer, fall, because it's got to get ready for 8 months of winter. So it needs to really slow its growth down to put energy reserves into the root system. Okay, if you've got another cousin in California and they're asking you what to plant, then in Southern California, there's never a cold period. So there's no reason to plant something that's getting ready for winter. You'd plant something that continues to grow. Let me give you a little bit better example of this. You take Florida 77, that's a fall dormancy of 9, compared to Travoy, an older variety that has a fall dormancy of 1. This is a picture taken when I was a graduate student at the University of Georgia, and this is taken in late November. So tremendous difference in fall growth. But if we had these 2 varieties planted in Kentucky, and we get any kind of winter, and this Florida 77 is continuing to try to grow, then it's going to freeze back, it's going to winter kill. The Travoy would live through any winter we have in Kentucky, and actually any winter in North Dakota and any winter in Alaska. But you look at the growth, you're not getting much in the fall, and it's also going to be slower coming back in the spring. So what we're looking at more are something like a fall dormancy of a 4 in Kentucky. So we do get growth in the late summer, fall. We do get spring green up at a reasonable time, but we know that it's going to survive the winter. So when you're looking at varieties and you're saying, what do I know about that variety based on the variety test information you have or based on the chart that's in the back of your proceedings, then in Kentucky we recommend varieties that have a fall dormancy of 4 or 5. I've talked to a few growers today, and even though the 5s have a little more fall growth, a little quicker in the spring, most cases in Kentucky, those do fine surviving our winters. If you thought to yourself, I want to really be conservative, I want to be ready for that one winter in 10 that might be really cold or really open, then the fall dormancy of 4 would be a little bit more conservative. So really either are good options, but don't just choose it based on the fall dormancy. Make sure that you're looking at how well it survived in the years that we've tested it. There's another rating that you'll see in the chart at the back of the book called winter survival. I mention it. We don't talk about it a lot in Kentucky because we don't have severe winters, but you will see that in some of the company information. The main point I want to make, obviously a lower number is better. Extremely winter hardy is a 1, but it's just a 1 to 6 rating scale. So don't get it confused with fall dormancy that goes 1 to 11. They're not going to match up with the numbers. But we mainly talk fall dormancy because that's still a very useful trait for the kind of winter conditions we have in Kentucky, looking at those fall dormancy of 4s or 5s work in many cases. Anyone know what allelopathy is in alfalfa? There's toxins in alfalfa to its own plants or its own seedlings. So in a mature alfalfa plant is producing, I hate to use the word toxins, but I guess they are because they're inhibiting the growth of new seedlings. So if you let an alfalfa plant go to seed, and seed falls in the ground, then the advantage is the mature plant that's there rather than the new seedlings. It's a unique thing in alfalfa because the allelopathy is really an autotoxicity to its own plant. You can plant other things in alfalfa and they do fine. Now the reason I'm mentioning this is that there's no variety of alfalfa that's safe to plant into an existing stand. And every year I hear people ask me, well, I've heard about a variety that no longer has that allelopathic effect. I can plant it right into an existing stand. Just yesterday, one of the seed company reps on the KFGC board said that he'd been asked by people from southern states and some growers, or he'd heard that Roundup Ready alfalfa, certain varieties, can be planted directly into an old stand. And that's not true. In fact, let me go down here and show you something else. Dr. John Jennings showed that new seedlings of alfalfa, if you do go into that existing stand, they're going to rarely emerge within 8 inches of an existing plant. And they're weak even when they're growing 8 to 16 inches from an existing plant. So you'd have to have an awful thin stand to be able to go in and successfully seed more alfalfa into it. So from a variety standpoint, there's no variety that is developed that can overcome that toxicity, that allelopathy. Okay, before I go into a little bit more detail with varieties, I wanted to make sure that right up front, I'm telling you that management is really the most important consideration to think about. And you're going to hear more about that from Dr. Teutsch talking about establishment, talking about Dr. Ritchie talking about soil fertility. Partly showing you this particular picture because you can go right now. This morning I Googled Alfalfa Management Guide. I came up with the PDF that's 88 pages long. You can print that off or look at it. Very detailed information covering all aspects of alfalfa management. This is the link down here, but you're really better just to Google it. So encourage you to get that. So no matter what I talk about varieties, you've got to be a good manager. And in fact, let me make one more comment. I learned this by experience in that we were planting some of the new Harv Extra low lignin alfalfa in an experiment. We put it on ground that we knew the history of it. We took a soil test. We planted it. It wasn't looking too good. I asked my technician, I said, when did you apply the lime and fertilizer that was called from the soil test? And he said, well, you didn't tell me to. And yeah, I didn't tell him to. I thought it was obvious. But we've struggled for 3 years to put enough lime, enough potash on that stand to keep those plants going. So don't bother planting any variety if you're not willing to do the management. I guess I should say that was part of the experiment, that we were going to see how it would do, but don't make our mistake. Okay, let me mention several important traits in thinking about varieties. Disease resistance is important. I'll give a bit more detail as I go through, and Kirsten will give a lot more detail in a little bit. The easiest thing in deciding a variety is getting one that's resistant to as many diseases as possible. I'll mention a couple specifically. There are some diseases that happen in alfalfa like Sclerotinia crown and root rot, that there's no resistance to. So the only way you're going to overcome that particular disease is by making sure if you're planting in the fall of the year, you plant late summer so the plants are big enough to not succumb to that disease. Typically it's in cool, wet falls, late October, early November. So late plantings, even the last few years, we've had some issues. I've not seen complete stand loss, but we've had issues. So you plant late summer to overcome that disease, or you plant in the spring. The other ones, your goal is just like the Phytophthora root rot, is to make sure that you've got varieties that show high levels of resistance. So there's a Phytophthora root rot. Here's a Phantomyces in the seedling year. We've had in the last 3 years some wet springs. So even on well-drained soils like you're supposed to plant alfalfa on, because it's been so wet, we've had some kind of waterlogged conditions, and that's been ideal for a Phantomyces. So if you plant a variety that has resistance or high levels of resistance, you cover that. There's actually been the emergence of another race or another strain of a Phantomyces. So you'd be even better off to plant something with resistance to a Phantomyces race 1 and race 2. And again, the varieties are listed in the back that have those resistances. The reason we say to get something that has a high resistance is that means more than 50% of the plants are going to be totally resistant to that disease. And here's an example. So you'd like to get a variety that has a lot of HRs. Okay, insect resistance. Dr. Townsend will talk to us a little bit more on that. If you look on the chart, there's a number of different insects that alfalfa varieties are resistant to. But many of those, particularly many of the aphids, are really only a problem in the western U.S. where they're growing seed. So from your standpoint, probably the one that makes the most difference is you may decide to choose a variety that has resistance to potato leafhopper, a common insect in our conditions. Dr. Townsend will talk about how to scout for that, how to determine if you spray. But there are new varieties that have decent levels of resistance to that. Pea aphids, sometimes we get issues with that, but rarely do we have enough that we need to spray. But getting pea aphid resistance in the variety is going to give you a benefit if we do have an outbreak. Alfalfa weevil, a few years ago, there were a number of varieties that were advertised as being resistant to alfalfa weevil. I don't know of any documented case where there's really genetic resistance. So that's something Dr. Townsend will talk about scouting for. I will say, though, going back to management, that this past year, particularly in central Kentucky, where we often don't have a severe weevil problems, there was some major outbreaks or major damage. And the stands that were marginal, maybe someone was trying to save a little bit on their lime, save a little bit on their potash, they were the ones that the weevil damaged, and it had a much harder time recovering. So any of these diseases or insects, if you keep the fertility up, you're going to do a better job of the alfalfa being able to outgrow the symptoms. But resistance is the best thing. If you go to alfalfa.org, you can download an alfalfa analyst that gives details, descriptions, and pictures on identifying disease and insect issues. I've just got a couple more minutes. So many of you have planted Roundup Ready alfalfa. We'll hear a little bit more about that in the last talk of the evening or the afternoon. Simply put, you've got a patch of Johnson grass in your field and you don't know what to do, and then it gets worse and worse, and Roundup is very effective. Roundup Ready alfalfa gives you an easy tool to control that and end up with a stand like this. But again, Roundup Ready alfalfa is not going to work if you don't have good soils, good pH, and good fertility. We'll hear more from Phil Bowman at the end of the day about the low lignin alfalfa, and so I'll leave him to talk about that and the advantage for quality with that. But the three main benefits, I'll just go ahead and mention it, and then he'll follow up with more detail. The advantage of reduced lignin is indigestible, so less lignin means more digestible forage. So that gives a higher quality forage. If you harvest at the normal stage, the normal late bud stage, gives a wider harvest window because it's not losing quality as quick, and it gives a higher yield because if you harvest later, if we let alfalfa go to early bloom stage, you get higher yield. Normally, though, you wouldn't wait till earlier mid-bloom because you lose so much quality. the low lignin alfalfa gives an advantage there. Grazing is another trait. We continue to do tests where we look at tolerance to grazing. So you can look at those tests. If you say, I want to plant something that I know I'm going to be grazing and I'm not going to be able to manage it quite as well as you would recommend with long rest periods, grazing tolerant alfalfas can be an advantage. So I'm going to end it there. If you don't get any of the other variety reports, encourage you to get this long-term summary because it not only has the alfalfa summary, it's got all of the other variety tests that we have in the ground right now. So I'll finish there, and we'll, I guess, of course, I've got time for a couple of questions. Any questions as Chris moves things over with the presentations? Yes, Jesse?